Tonight, as you settle into the quiet, you're about to discover the forgotten beginnings of the stories humans whispered to each other long before books, screens, or even written language existed. Folktales and bedtime stories were once our ancestors' way of keeping wisdom alive in the dark. Tiny sparks passed from one generation to the next. Before we drift into their origins, make sure to subscribe for more calming journeys into sleepy history, so you never miss a quiet escape like this one. Long before the first words were ever pressed into clay, long before ink touched papyrus or parchment, long before alphabets even existed, human beings shaped their understanding of the world through sound, through breath, through voice, through story. Imagine a world with no written record, no books to open, no scripts to memorize. The only archive that existed was memory. And the only way to preserve that memory was to speak it, again and again, allowing it to pass from one person to another like a warm ember carried between cupped hands. In those earliest days of humanity, stories were not entertainment in the way we think of them now. They were guidance. They were belief, education, fear, wonder, and comfort all woven into one continuous thread that stretched across countless generations. Picture the world of early humans. A wilderness of vast forests, roaring rivers, unbroken night skies, and storms that moved across the land as if powered by unseen giants. For people who had no understanding of meteorology, astronomy, or biology, the world was a place of powerful mystery. Every sound in the dark meant something. Every glowing star had a purpose. Every shift of the wind carried a whisper. And when the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the landscape into deep shadow, early communities gathered close around firelight, drawing warmth not only from the flickering flames but from one another's presence. Fire was safety. Fire was community. Fire was the first theater, the first classroom, the first storyteller's stage. Around those fires, elders would begin to speak. Their voices carried wisdom that had been handed down to them, wisdom they were obligated to pass forward. They described the rumbling sky as the roar of ancient beings, spirits who watched over the world. They explained the shift of seasons as the journey of a great cosmic traveler. They showed for children how animals came to be, not through biology, but through transformation, magic, or divine intention. These stories were woven from observation, imagination, and instinct, crafted not to give scientific answers but to provide a sense of meaning, a sense of order, in a world that could be both breathtakingly beautiful and terrifyingly unpredictable. Imagine a child listening to those stories. Their eyes would widen as sparks from the flames drifted upward like tiny stars escaping into the night. Scouts would hear how the sky spirits beating drums to warn them. They would learn that the winds carried messages from ancestors, urging people to stay vigilant or to prepare for change. They would hear tales about the sun described as a living creature, a fiery lion crossing the heavens each day, fighting off the darkness that threatened to consume the world every night. To the early listener, these stories were not metaphors. They were explanations. They were the truth as far as anyone knew it. But these tales were more than attempts to understand natural phenomena. They taught children how to survive. A story about a foolish hunter who wandered alone into the forest and never returned was not just a fable. It was a warning. A story about a river spirit who dragged careless people into the depths served as a lesson in respecting dangerous waters. Stories about shape-shifting animals, trickster creatures, and roaming shadows were part of a practical education system that relied entirely on memory and imagination. You learned how to avoid poisonous plants because someone told you about a mythical beast that lived near them. You learned to walk silently in the forest because the spirits there rewarded quiet travelers and punished the loud. A bedtime story was often a lesson disguised as a dream, and yet these stories were not only cautionary, they were comforting. When darkness fell, the world outside became a vast unknown. Predators lurked beyond the reach of the firelight. Storms could sweep in without warning. A simple injury, a twist of the ankle, or a cut from a sharp stone, could mean disaster. In such a world, the reassurance that the universe was filled with beings who watched over you, who shaped events and protected your tribe, brought incredible comfort. A child falling asleep to tales of ancestors guiding the stars might feel less afraid of the darkness pressing in from all sides. Stories wrapped them in a blanket of belief, softening the fear of the unknown. As time passed, stories shifted and evolved. Oral traditions were fluid things. Each storyteller added their own embellishments, shaped narratives to match the needs of the moment, and adapted lessons for new generations. Rare. The rhythm of the voice, the patterns of repetition, and the slow, soothing pace made these stories ideal for bedtime. They lulled listeners into calmness, letting imagination replace the harsh reality of the world outside the fire's glow. Storytelling became a nightly ritual, a way to bring the entire community together at the end of a long day of hunting, gathering, crafting tools, or preparing shelters. In many cultures, bedtime stories weren't only for children. Adults listened too, finding peace in familiar tales told in familiar voices. There were stories that explained where humans came from. These narratives spoke of the earth forming from the body of a giant creature, or of humans being shaped from clay, wood, or the breath of a god. There were stories about the first animals, how the fox earned its cunning nature, how the eagle learned to fly higher than all others, why the bear sleeps through winter, and why the owl watches silently from the trees. Each tale helped early people make sense of behaviors they observed in the world around them, and because these stories were told over and over, they became deeply rooted in cultural identity. Some stories existed to explain dreams themselves. Early humans believed that dreams were messages carried by spirits or ancestors, delivered as symbolic imagery. A child who dreamed of water might be told that change was coming. Someone who dreamed of fire might be warned to stay close to home. Bedtime stories often merged with dream interpretation, creating a continuous cycle of narrative and meaning that shaped both waking life and sleep. Over thousands of years, as groups traveled, migrated, and interacted with other tribes, stories began to spread far beyond their original homes. A tale born in one region could travel hundreds of miles and slowly transform as it passed from one community to another. Themes that were once tied to local landscapes could shift to new environments, taking on different colors and textures while preserving the core idea. This is why so many ancient folk tales across different cultures share similar structures. The hero's journey, the wise trickster, the dangerous forest, the magical transformation. Though separated by rivers, mountains, and oceans, humans everywhere shared the same need to explain the world and comfort their children at night. This common need created the earliest global narratives, long before written language made such connections visible. As humanity developed tools, built shelters, formed communities, and eventually began agriculture, daily life slowly changed. The tradition of nighttime storytelling remained essential. Even when the first symbols were carved into wood or stone, they were not meant to replace the oral stories, but to preserve what could no longer be safely held in memory alone. Before writing, knowledge could be lost in a single generation if no one remained to tell the tale. The drought, a migration, a conflict, or the death of a single elder could mean the disappearance of an entire body, a cultural history. Oral storytelling was a fragile, living archive, its survival dependent on continuity and community. Despite this fragility, oral tradition proved incredibly durable. Tens of thousands of years, long before the invention of the wheel or the domestication of animals, people preserved complex narratives in their minds. These stories were spoken aloud so often that even small details were kept intact. With storytellers guided by rhythm, pattern, and memory, repetition was a powerful tool. You might hear the same story every night for years, yet each retelling felt like hearing something new. Imagine again the night sky of early humanity, a sky far darker, far fuller than anything visible today. The Milky Way would stretch across the heavens like a shimmering river. Every constellation visible to our ancestors carried a meaning. The stars were not distant burning spheres, but characters and stories. Ancestors walking the sky, animals frozen in time, heroes who had ascended after great deeds. Bedtime stories were often tied directly to these celestial patterns, helping children navigate the world long before maps existed. If you knew the story of a particular constellation, you also knew where to look to find your bearings at night. Story and survival were endlessly intertwined. Thunderstorms were another source of storytelling. Without scientific understanding, the earth shaking beneath your feet or the sky splitting open with lightning could only be interpreted as the action of powerful beings. Some stories described thunder as a warning from mountain spirits, others as the battle cries of sky deities, others still as the result of celestial animals racing through the heavens. When children heard these stories before bed, they learned that storms were not random or terrifying forces. They were predictable events shaped by beings who, though powerful, had intentions and emotions humans could understand. A storm became a narrative, not a threat. Over time, as communities grew, so did the complexity of their stories. Entire cycles of tales emerged, detailing the lives of legendary ancestors, the creation of the world, the meaning behind rituals, and the origins of each plant, animal, and landscape feature. Bedtime stories often took the gentler parts of these vast mythologies and transformed them into calming narratives that eased children into sleep. Sometimes they told of distant lands where spirits lived peacefully, or of animals who helped humans survive. Sometimes they described the first discoveries, how fire was brought to humanity by a daring creature, or how the first shelters were inspired by watching birds build nests. These tales offered hope during difficult times. When winter lingered too long or food became scarce, stories reminded people that hardships were part of larger cycles. They told of ancestors who faced similar trials and overcame them. They reassured the young that even when the world seemed uncertain, humans had always found ways to survive. Bedtime storytelling became both emotional comfort and psychological resilience. Eventually, as writing systems emerged across different civilizations, the stories that had once lived only in memory began to take form in physical materials. Clay tablets in Mesopotamia recorded epic narratives. Ancient Egypt preserved myths on papyrus scrolls. Chinese storytellers used silk and bamboo. But even then, the tradition of telling stories aloud did not fade away. People continued to gather around firelight, lamps, and later candles, passing on tales through voice long after writing became widespread. There is a reason why even today, with books, movies, and digital media everywhere, children still ask to be told a bedtime story in the soft voice of someone they trust. It is an ancient instinct, deeply rooted in us, reaching back to those first fires where humans huddled together to survive the night. In those earliest eras, when the world was mysterious and harsh, storytelling was the one tool that made sense of everything. It shaped how people saw the sky, the earth, the animals, and themselves. It formed identity and culture. It comforted the frightened and educated the young. It preserved memories, explained the unknown, and built connections between generations. These spoken tales, carried through thousands of years of human history, became the foundations of folktales, myths, legends, and bedtime stories that continue to live today. And so, as you imagine those ancient fires and the voices that rose in rhythm with the crackling flames, you are touching something incredibly old, something older than writing, older than civilization, older even than many of the landscapes we know today. You are listening to echoes that stretch back to the very beginning of humanity's attempt to understand its place in the world. Long before ink ever dried, stories were born in breath, in warmth, in darkness, and in the soft moments before sleep, where imagination makes its home and where tales, once spoken by our earliest ancestors, continue to drift gently across the ages. As the world continued to change and humans settled into villages and early civilizations, the role of the storyteller grew even more important. No longer was storytelling just a nightly ritual for small, nomadic groups. It became a central part of culture, a gathering point for communities, and a way to keep traditions alive as societies grew larger and more complex. Even as agriculture took root and people no longer had to wander in search of food, the challenges of early settlement brought new uncertainties. Floods could wipe out crops, diseases could spread rapidly, conflicts could arise between neighboring groups. And through all of this, the voice of the storyteller remained a constant presence, a calm reminder that every hardship had been faced before, that every question had once been answered in the glow of firelight. In these growing communities, storytellers held a respected place. They were not simply entertainers. They were keepers of knowledge. Before written law, they remembered the rules of the tribe. Before history books, they preserved the deeds of ancestors. Before calendars, they knew the cycle of seasons through tales that marked the turning of the year. And before maps, they carried the landscape in their minds, describing distant rivers, mountains, and forests through stories that guided travelers. To know the stories of your people was to know who you were. Yet storytelling was not always formal. Some of the most important tales were whispered in the quietest moments. A parent soothing a restless child, a grandparent calming a frightened one during a storm, siblings telling gentle tales to each other as they drifted towards sleep. It is easy to imagine a small hut lit only by embers, the air cool and still, the sounds of insects just outside the thin walls. A child curls close to their parent, and in a low, rhythmic voice, the parent repeats stories passed down from their own childhood. Stories of how the moon came to be, how the first snow fell, how the river spirit protects travelers at night. These were not grand myths told in public gatherings. They were intimate moments where narrative and comfort blended into something almost sacred. These small bedtime stories were often filled with gentleness. While daytime tales might speak of hunts, battles, or heroic quests, nighttime stories tended to celebrate quiet moments. A small animal finding shelter, a plant taking root, a star finding its place in the sky. Such stories calmed the mind and softened the fears that often came with darkness. Even in communities with strong beliefs in spirits or the supernatural, bedtime stories tended to portray the night as a realm protected by benevolent forces, guardians who watched over sleepers until dawn returned. As civilizations developed written language, the balance between written text and spoken word began to shift. But even the earliest written stories, carved, etched, or painted, retain the cadence of oral tradition. The first myths written in ancient Sumer, for example, sound like they were meant to be spoken aloud. Egyptian tales recorded on papyrus read like bedtime stories, told in the chambers of royal children. Chinese legends written on silk preserved the same rhythm as the folk tales shared in small rural homes. Writing did not replace oral storytelling. It captured it, preserved it, and allowed it to travel farther than ever before. Still, something unique remained in the spoken word. When a story is told aloud, it carries the breath, the pauses, the emotion, the subtle shifts in tone that no ink can fully capture. A storyteller can adapt on the spot, lingering on a soothing detail if a listener seems anxious, softening a harsh moment, or reshaping a lesson to fit the needs of the time. This flexibility kept oral storytelling alive, even as writing blossomed. Farmers returning from fields, merchants resting after long journeys, and families settling in after a day of labor still gathered to hear stories spoken, not read. And storytelling continued to evolve. Travelers brought tales from distant lands, merging them with local traditions. A story heard from a passing trader might become part of a village's bedtime ritual. A myth shared by a traveler. Avoiding a storm might be retold by a grandmother, comforting her grandchildren generations later. Some of the world's most universal tales, trickster stories, tales of helpful animals, gentle stories about friendship or kindness, emerged from this mixing of cultures. Even today, many bedtime stories across the world share these timeless elements without their listeners knowing they are participating in a tradition older than civilization itself. Imagine a traveler in ancient times, weary from a long journey, arriving at a small settlement just as night begins to fall. They are invited to sit by the fire with strangers who feel like friends. After a simple meal, the traveler begins sharing a tale from their homeland. Perhaps a story about how the stars were born from the lanterns of wandering spirits, or how the first river was formed from the tears of a goddess. The villagers listen, captivated. Later, when the traveler continues on their way, someone in the village repeats the story to a child who cannot sleep. The tale takes root, finds a place, and becomes part of the community's own collection of bedtime stories. In this way, stories traveled far beyond borders long before maps or nations existed. And slowly, as centuries passed, bedtime storytelling took on symbolic meaning. Parents began to associate it with love and protection. A child who received a gentle story before sleep was reminded that they were safe, watched over, and deeply cared for. In many cultures, the last words spoken before sleep held special importance, a belief that these final thoughts shaped one's dreams. So families chose stories that offered peace, hope, or inspiration. They chose tales with soft endings, comforting imagery, and rhythms that encouraged calmness. The tradition became almost a form of nightly blessing. Even societies with advanced writing systems, such as Greece, Rome, Persia, and India, continued to pass down stories orally. In these places, literacy was often limited, and books were precious objects unavailable to most people. The average child learned about gods, heroes, and the natural world not from scrolls or tablets, but from the voices of parents, storytellers, and elders. A bedtime story was the first education, the earliest form of philosophy, the foundation of moral understanding. As humans spread across continents and adapted to new environments, bedtime storytelling adapted as well. In cold regions, stories often centered on warmth, fire, and endurance. In desert cultures, tales celebrated water, journeys, and stars guiding travelers through endless night skies. In tropical climates, stories pulsed with the life of forests, rivers, and vibrant animals. Yet despite the differences in landscapes, the purpose remained the same: to ease the transition from wakefulness to sleep, to make the night feel less intimidating, and to connect the listener to the long chain of ancestors who had listened to similar stories beneath similar skies. Even today, we feel the echo of these ancient practices. When someone reads a story to a child at night, even a modern story with cars, cities, or imaginary creatures, the act is an unbroken continuation of something that began tens of thousands of years ago around primal fires. The gentle voice, the quiet room, the drifting imagination, the sense of safety as eyes grow heavy, all of it is part of the same tradition that helped humans understand their world when they knew almost nothing of its science. In a sense, when we tell a bedtime story, we become part of a lineage older than history. We speak in the same cadence our ancestors used. We mirror their instinct to soothe, to teach, to protect. And in moments when the world feels uncertain or overwhelming, bedtime stories still offer the same comfort they once gave to children huddled in ancient shelters. They remind us that humans have always found ways to face the dark. They show us that even when knowledge was limited and fears were great, imagination provided a way forward, and the glow of a story, like the glow of firelight, continues to guide us gently into the night. Folktales were not merely stories meant to entertain. They were the earliest form of education, designed long before chalk, slates, or classrooms existed. When the world was unpredictable, when dangers lurked behind trees, inside caves, and beyond the glow of the fire, children needed guidance. But teaching them wasn't as simple as giving orders or setting rules. Instead, adults wove lessons into tales, stories that sparkled with imagination, wrapped in wonder, disguised as adventures. Through these stories, early humans taught their young how to survive, how to understand the world, and how to navigate the uncertain path between childhood and adulthood. Between childhood, thousands of years ago, sitting on the cool earth as the fire crackled in the night. The stars overhead were bright enough to cast faint shadows, and the smell of smoke drifted through the air. The child's eyes were wide, eager to listen, because this was the time of learning disguised as magic. An elder, perhaps a parent or grandparent, would begin to speak, not in the rigid tone of a teacher, but with the soft cadence of a storyteller. Every word carried meaning and history, shaped by generations who learned before them. Through stories, the adults explained the dangers of wandering alone, the importance of respecting others, the value of bravery, and sometimes even the mysteries of the world beyond what they could see. One of the earliest forms of instruction came in the shape of warning tales. These stories served as a protective shield, giving children a framework for survival. In a world filled with predators, wolves, bears, snakes, children needed to know how to stay safe. Instead of frightening them with blunt threats, families told tales of creatures who lived in the forest, beings that were often exaggerated versions of real animals. The creatures in these stories might howl like a wolf, prowl like a lion, or hiss like a serpent, but they carried with them a deeper purpose. Through these narratives, children learned, don't wander too far, don't stray from the group, stay near the fire at night, and always listen for danger. But even within those fearful tales, there was something enchanting. The creatures were not just threats, they were characters with personality and motive. Some could be outsmarted, others could be befriended. This blend of fear and imagination helped children internalize essential lessons without feeling overwhelmed. They learned that the world was vast and unpredictable, yet it could be navigated with caution, cleverness, and respect. Beyond warnings, folk tales also served as gentle guides for moral behavior. In societies without written laws or complex systems of discipline, stories shaped the foundation of ethics. A tale about a boastful hunter taught humility. A story of a greedy gatherer who took more than he needed revealed the consequences of selfishness, and a narrative about a kind traveler rewarded by the spirits of the forest encouraged generosity. These tales were memorable because they didn't simply list do's and don'ts. They illustrated them in vibrant color. Children saw themselves in the characters. They understood the emotions, the choices, and the outcomes. When the storyteller paused, letting the lessons sink into the soft quiet of the night, the meaning lingered long after the flames had died down. In many cultures, stories explained not just how to live safely, but how to behave kindly. A child learning through stories discovered the value of honesty not through punishment, but through the journey of a fictional character who faced the consequences of deceit. Similarly, the importance of cooperation was taught through tales where villagers survived a hardship only by working together, sharing food, or helping one another. These stories became the invisible pillars of society, silent guardians of tradition and harmony. Over time, bedtime became a sacred ritual, one of the only moments in a day when work paused, worries softened, and families gathered close. Children grew excited for the stories not just because they entertained. Long before lullabies or illustrated books, these stories were the soothing rhythm that carried young minds into dreams. And unknown to the children, the stories were shaping them, helping them become thoughtful, resilient, and perceptive. Folktales often explored emotions that children didn't yet know how to express. Fear, loneliness, hope, jealousy, love, all were explored through the arcs of heroes and creatures, kings and commoners, animals and spirits. By listening, children learned what to feel and how to understand those feelings. A lonely character finding friendship taught the comfort of companionship. A frightened character facing the dark taught courage. A child who made a mistake and learned from it helped young listeners understand that errors were part of growing. In many early societies, children also learned cultural identity through stories. They discovered where their people came from, what challenges they had overcome, and what values they cherished. Stories explained why certain animals were sacred, why particular rituals existed, and why respect for the land was essential. Through stories, children inherited the history and soul of their ancestors. The tales were oral museum pieces, living artifacts passed from lips to ears, from one heart to another. The beauty of folktales was not in their simplicity, but in their adaptability. The storyteller could adjust a tale depending on the listener's needs. If a child struggled with sharing, the storyteller might emphasize scenes about generosity. If a child feared the dark, the tale could highlight bravery. If siblings quarreled, the storyteller might select a story that hinted at the strength of unity. Each retelling became a personalized lesson, disguised as imagination. As civilizations grew and villages became towns, the stories evolved too. They traveled along trade routes carried by travelers, merchants, migrants, and wanderers. When people from different cultures met, whether peacefully or through conflict, their stories mixed. Sometimes a tale from one side of the world found new life in another, adapted to new landscapes, new values, and new characters. What began as a story about a desert spirit might, generations later, become a forest creature in a distant land. A tale born in icy mountains could transform it into a story told along warm coastlines. These traveling tales taught children something even more profound, that the world was bigger than they knew. They learned that people far away also told stories, also loved their families, also struggled, and also sought meaning. This realization planted early seeds of empathy, an understanding that other people, even strangers, experienced life in ways both different and deeply similar. In some cultures, especially in ancient civilizations, storytellers held respected positions. They were the keepers of memory, the guardians of wisdom. Children looked up to them with awe, believing they had access to secret knowledge. In truth, they did. They carried within them the accumulated lessons of hundreds of lives, thousands of nights, and countless generations. They were the living libraries of their people. Every time they spoke, they weren't just telling a story. They were continuing an unbroken chain of learning. In many societies, folk tales taught survival not only in the wilderness, but in the complexities of social life. Children learned how to resolve conflicts, how to recognize deception, how to choose friends wisely, and how to respect elders. A tale about two siblings who fought constantly might end with them needing each other during a moment of crisis, teaching children that unity was worth more than pride. A story of a trickster who fooled the villagers might teach caution and critical thinking. Through these tales, children developed emotional intelligence long before the term existed. Of course, not all stories were serious or heavy with meaning. Some were simply silly, filled with exaggerated characters and humorous scenes. These stories also served a purpose. They taught children that laughter was important, that joy was part of life, and that learning didn't always have to be solemn. They brought balance. After all, life itself was a blend of joy, fear, curiosity, and comfort. The stories reflected this natural rhythm. But perhaps the most profound aspect of folktales was how they bonded families. A child listening to a story could feel the presence and warmth of the storyteller. The sound of a familiar voice, the rise and fall of tone, the brief pauses, the soft laughter, these sensory moments became imprinted memories. Even as children grew older and learned the lessons behind the stories, they carried with them the emotional connection to those who taught them. Folktales weren't just tools for teaching, they were vessels of love. This emotional connection helped the lessons endure. A rule spoken once could be forgotten. A punishment might create resentment. But a story lingered. It could be remembered in adulthood, passed on to another child, adapted, retold, reshaped, but never lost. Even today, many of the tales we hear in modern children's books, movies, and bedtime routines are echoes of ancient ones. They still teach kindness, courage, resourcefulness, and empathy, just as they did thousands of years ago. As societies shifted from oral traditions to written ones, the stories gained permanence. They found their way onto scrolls, tablets, papyrus, and later, into books. But the heart of storytelling remained the same. Even with words on a page, the purpose endured. To teach gently, to guide, to soothe, to prepare. Today, when a parent reads to a child at bedtime, a faint echo of that ancient tradition remains. The setting may be modern, the glow of a lamp instead of firelight, a soft bed instead of packed earth, but the essence is unchanged. The child listens, learns, feels comforted, and drifts into dreams shaped by tales older than memory itself. And so, folktales continue their quiet work. They help children explore feelings, understand the world, and imagine possibilities. They remind us that storytelling is one of the most enduring human instincts, a bridge between generations, a vessel for wisdom, a cradle for the young. Even in a world filled with screens and digital distractions, the ancient power of stories persists. In the end, folk tales were never just stories. They were survival guides, emotional maps, moral compasses, and gentle teachers. They shaped childhood across centuries, across continents, across cultures. They taught children how to be careful, how to be kind, how to be clever, how to be clever, how to be brave, and ultimately, how to be human. And though the world has changed, the need for such stories has not. The lessons are as relevant today as they were when told under the stars to children who knew only firelight. Storytelling, in its quiet, timeless way, continues to guide us, one bedtime, one tale, one generation at a time. Every culture on Earth, from the smallest nomadic clan to the grandest ancient civilization, crafted its own version of sleep stories. Whispers meant to ease children into dreams and carry the wisdom of the people across generations. While their languages, landscapes, and beliefs differed, the impulse behind the stories was the same: to comfort, to teach, to explain, and to connect. These were not just tales told before sleep. They were cultural fingerprints, soft reflections of how each community understood life, nature, spirits, and the mysteries that surrounded them. A bedtime tale about a hunter who disrespected a seal spirit wasn't simply moral guidance. It was a reminder that life in the North depended on harmony with nature. When children fell asleep, they dreamed of icy landscapes, patient animals, and ancestors walking across frozen worlds, guiding their steps. Far across the world, in the ancient civilizations that rose from fertile river valleys, bedtime stories took on grand and mythic forms. In Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, Greece, China, Persia, and later Rome, tales were not only spoken around fires but eventually preserved in written texts, allowing them to travel far beyond their original homes. These were places of empires, temples, scholars, merchants, and enormous cultural exchange, and their sleep stories reflected the complexity of their societies. In ancient Egypt, for example, bedtime stories often revolved around gods who oversaw every aspect of life: sunrise, harvests, death, rebirth, floods, and protection. A child might fall asleep listening to the story of Ra sailing across the sky in his golden barge, or Isis searching for Osiris, or the gentle goddess Hathor comforting the world with music and joy. These stories taught children that even in the uncertainties of the desert, from sandstorms to sickness, divine forces watched over them. The world was alive with meaning, filled with invisible threads connecting humans to the gods. In Greece, bedtime stories emerged from a rich tapestry of myths featuring heroic quests, cunning mortals, and unpredictable gods. A child might drift off hearing about Perseus defeating the Gorgon, or Demeter's grief turning the earth barren. These myths offered explanations for natural cycles, human behavior, and the mysterious balance between fate and free will. For Greek children, the stories weren't distant fantasies. They were a way of understanding themselves, their families, and the moral choices they would face. Then travel east into ancient China, where bedtime stories were deeply influenced by philosophy, ancestry, and the harmony of the natural world. Tales of dragons, wise scholars, clever fox spirits, and loyal children carried Confucian values of respect, honesty, and kindness. A child might hear a story teaching the importance of filial piety or the beauty of patience. Many tales explain the origins of mountains, rivers, or customs, giving children both moral guidance and cultural identity. Across the mountains into India, stories took on vibrant layers of spirituality, music, color, and cosmic meaning. Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain traditions wove tales of gods, reincarnation, karma, dharma, and the eternal dance of creation and destruction. Children listened to stories of Hanuman leaping across oceans, of Krishna playing his flute under moonlight, of the Buddha teaching compassion through parables. These stories weren't just narratives. They were pathways to understanding the purpose of life, the power of kindness, and the nature of the universe. In the Middle East, richly woven tales emerged in the crossroads of deserts, trade routes, and empires. Storytelling became an art, filled with magical companions, wise travelers, hidden treasures, and mysterious lessons. Children fell asleep listening to tales that later formed part of what the world knows as 1001 Nights, stories of jennies, flying carpets, brave queens, and wandering adventurers. These stories taught courage, cleverness, and resilience while reflecting the beauty and challenges of life in the desert. Move onward into Africa, a vast continent where each region developed its own storytelling traditions. In West Africa, griots, respected storytellers and historians, kept alive the memory of kings, ancestors, and moral lessons through oral tales passed from generation to generation. Children heard stories about Anansi the spider, the clever trickster who used brains instead of strength, or tales of heroic warriors and wise animals, teaching humility and courage. These stories cultivated imagination as well as social understanding, teaching children that even the smallest creature could outwit the strongest opponent if they used their mind well. In East Africa, stories were often tied to nature, explaining why certain animals behaved the way they did, why the world was formed in specific ways, or why rituals mattered. Children could fall asleep hearing about the origins of the moon, the ocean, or the mountains, allowing them to drift into dreams filled with landscapes that felt alive with spirit and meaning. Across the ocean, in the Americas before colonization, storytelling was central to cultural identity. In North America, tribes such as the Navajo, Lakota, Haudenosaunee, and countless others shaped bedtime stories around creation myths, animal spirits, and the deep connection between land and people. A child might hear a tale about how Coyote tricked the world into motion, or how Raven brought light into the sky. In South America, stories from the Inca, Maya, and other cultures spoke of celestial beings, powerful mountains, sacred animals, and gods who shaped the world. These stories guided children in understanding their place within the cosmic order. Even in the islands of the Pacific, Hawaii, Samoa, Fiji, Tahiti, and beyond, children fell asleep to stories carried on ocean winds. Tales of ocean spirits, voyaging ancestors, powerful chiefs, and shape-shifting gods helped young listeners understand courage, responsibility, and the importance of respecting the sea. The vast Pacific itself became a living character in their stories. Mysterious, nurturing, and unpredictable. Though the landscapes, languages, and beliefs varied, the emotional purpose of these stories remained remarkably similar across cultures. They soothed children, helping them feel safe even when the world around them was full of unknowns. They taught lessons about life, nature, community, and the unseen forces believed to influence the world. They connected each generation to the one before it, and prepared children for the one after. As civilizations expanded, trade routes opened, and interactions increased, some stories began to merge, transform, or travel. A tale told in one region might evolve into a new version far away. The bones of the story remained, but the details shifted to match local customs or landscapes. This exchange of stories became a quiet form of cultural blending, nations sharing not just goods but imagination. Even today, echoes of these ancient sleep stories remain alive. The fairy tales, bedtime books, nursery rhymes, and animated stories we share with children are modern versions of the same ritual that has existed since humans first gathered under the stars. The details have changed, but the sense of comfort, meaning, and connection remains. When a child today drifts off while listening to a bedtime story, they're participating in something almost as old as humanity itself. From forest tribes to Arctic hunters, from nomadic wanderers to temple builders, from mountain people to island navigators, every culture has shaped sleep stories that carry the spirit of their world. And in the quiet moments before sleep, those stories continue to whisper across time, reminding us that we are all part of one long, interconnected human tale, told in many voices, in many forms, yet united in purpose, to comfort, to guide, and to dream. Long before humans built cities, long before they carved symbols into stone or inked words onto paper, the world around them was their greatest teacher. Nature was not silent to them. It spoke constantly in every sound, every shift of the wind, every glimmer of the sky. They didn't see the natural world as a collection of objects or forces, but as a living presence filled with emotion, intention, and spirit. Early storytellers sitting beside fires that flickered like watchful eyes looked into the vastness of the earth and sky and gave the unknown a voice. They wrapped the mysteries of the natural world in stories so vivid that they became the first myths. Tales where thunder walked on giant feet, where the moon wandered as a lonely traveler, where forests breathed with spirits and mountains guarded ancient secrets. Imagine a time when the world was truly dark at night, with no lamps, no electricity, no distant glow of cities on the horizon. Night was a deep, almost tangible thing. A single fire might be the only circle of safety in a sea of shadows. In that darkness, every sound felt amplified. A snapping branch could be, or at least might be, the footstep of something unseen. The rumble of thunder could be the growl of a massive creature. A streak of lightning could be the anger of the god. Early humans, searching for meaning, turned these enigmas into stories that explained their world in ways their hearts could understand. Thunder, for instance, was too powerful, too sudden, too overwhelming to be explained by mere chance. And so, in one culture, thunder became the footsteps of a great sky giant marching across the heavens. In another, it was the sound of divine chariots racing to battle. Some believed it was a celestial drummer beating the rhythm of the storm. Others imagined it as the roaring laughter of a powerful spirit celebrating victory. These interpretations weren't foolish, they were deeply human. They turned fear into familiarity, turning the sky from a threat into a landscape of majestic beings guiding the world from above. Lightning, too, became a character. It was often imagined as a spear thrown by a god, as a message from the spirits, or as a warning. When lightning struck a tree, splitting it open with blinding force, the storytellers explained it as a sign, maybe of anger, maybe of protection, maybe of a spirit marking the land. Through these tales, children learned caution, but also wonder. They didn't just fear storms, they respected them. They saw in each bolt of light a reminder that the world was alive with powers far beyond their reach. The moon, with its quiet glow and slow, steady wandering across the sky, became a source of both comfort and mystery. Early humans noticed how the moon changed shape, disappearing completely only to return again. This rhythm became the heartbeat of many myths. In some cultures, the moon was a gentle guardian who watched over travelers at night. In others, it was a lonely deity searching endlessly for a lost companion. Some imagine the moon as a patient teacher counting the cycles of life, marking time before calendars existed. When the moon was full, children might listen to stories about how it grew round and bright to shine a path for lost souls. When the moon thinned into a delicate crescent, they learned that it was resting, gathering strength. And when it vanished entirely, storytellers whispered that the moon had gone on a journey to the other world, a visit that ensured harmony between the realms of the living and the dead. Such tales softened the fear of night, turning darkness into a place of magic rather than terror. The sun, too, inspired countless myths. Its warmth, its life-giving light, its predictable rising and setting, all felt like the actions of a powerful, benevolent figure. In some myths, the sun was a god carried across the sky in a golden chariot. In others, it was a giant bird soaring with shimmering wings. Some imagined the sun being swallowed at dusk by a vast cosmic creature, only to be reborn at dawn. Through these stories, early listeners understood that each day was a gift, each sunrise a blessing, and each sunset a moment of transition between the worlds of light and shadow. Forests were another source of deep mythic inspiration. To early humans, forests were wondrous and dangerous. They were filled with food, water, herbs that healed, but also predators, poisonous plants, and hidden paths where one could easily lose their way. It made perfect sense then that forests became the home of spirits. Trees became ancient guardians. The rustling of leaves became whispers from invisible beings. A sudden gust of wind might be the breath of a woodland deity. A fallen tree could mark where a giant spirit once walked. Inside these woods, myths flourished. Some cultures believed that each tree held a soul, watching over those who respected the forest and punishing those who harmed it. Others imagined shape-shifting beings who lived within the thickets, creatures who could appear as animals, humans, or shadows. These stories taught children not just to fear the forest, but to honor it. They learned to tread lightly, to listen carefully, to understand that nature was alive and aware. Rivers, too, were personified. Flowing water, constantly moving, gave rise to myths of river gods and goddesses, water spirits, and guardians of the deep. The gentle bubbling of a stream might be interpreted as laughter. The surge of a rapid could be anger or excitement. Many cultures believed that rivers carried messages from the spirit world. Children listening to bedtime stories would fall asleep imagining water beings guiding the flow of life, protecting travelers, or reminding humans to treat the water with respect. Mountains were some of the earliest symbols of the sacred. Towering above everything else, they seemed to touch the heavens. Early storytellers crafted myths about deities who lived at their peaks, giants who slumbered beneath them, or cosmic battles that shaped their slopes. Some believed mountains were the bones of ancient dragons long turned to stone. Others said they were gateways to the divine world. A trembling of the earth, an earthquake, became a sign that these powerful beings were stirring. Volcanoes inspired both fear and reverence. Their eruptions were too extraordinary, too violent, too fiery to be seen as anything less than the breath of gods. Myths arose of fire spirits, wrathful deities, or underworld beings trying to break through the earth's crust. These stories taught children that nature's power was something to honor, to fear, and to live alongside with humility. Oceans and seas became vast kingdoms filled with mythical creatures. The unknown depths, the great waves, the sudden storms, all seemed like the actions of enormous beings hidden beneath the water. Early storytellers described gods who ruled the sea, creatures with shimmering scales who guided ships, and monsters whose movements caused whirlpools or tidal waves. Fishermen told tales of spirits who could bless or curse their journeys, teaching the value of respect, gratitude, and cautious bravery. Even small details of the natural world sparked myths. A rainbow might be a bridge between worlds. A comet might be the torch of a wandering spirit. A particular stone might hold the trapped soul of a warrior. Every piece of nature held potential meaning, and storytellers were the interpreters. Animals, too, played starring roles in myths and legends. Before domestication, animals were competitors, threats, teachers, and mysterious neighbors. Wolves became symbols of loyalty and danger. Bears were revered for their strength and survival instincts. Birds, especially those that soared high into the sky, were seen as messengers between worlds. Snakes became symbols of rebirth, wisdom, or treachery, depending on the culture. Lions, tigers, eagles, foxes, each creature offered inspiration for stories that helped early humans interpret what they saw around them. These animal-inspired myths also conveyed essential lessons. A story about a clever fox taught wit and caution. A tale about a loyal wolf pack illustrated familial bonds and teamwork. Stories of trickster animals showed children that intelligence could overcome strength. Through these tales, children learned not only how to behave, but how to observe animals and understand the rhythms of the natural world. Weather patterns, too, became characters. The wind became a playful spirit, a messenger, or a warning. Rain could be the tears of a goddess or the blessing of a grateful sky. Snow might be the breath of the winter god or the cloak of spirits who wandered unseen. Every shift in weather carried a story that soothed fears and explained the cycles of nature. Many myths connected natural events with the origins of humanity itself. People asked, where did we come from? Why do we live the way we do? How are we connected to the earth? And the storytellers answered with poetic imagery. Some myths said humans came from clay shaped by divine hands. Others claimed humans were born from trees, flowers, or stars. In some tales, humans were once animals who changed form. These stories gave people a sense of belonging, an understanding that they were not separate from nature but deeply rooted within it. As centuries passed, cultures evolved, but the essence of nature-born myths endured. They adapted, transformed, merged, and traveled. Some became shared across continents, others remained unique to a single village or tribe. but all carried the same core purpose: to explain the world, to comfort the fearful, to spark imagination, and to keep wisdom alive. Even today, echoes of these ancient myths remain. Children still learn stories about gods of thunder, spirits of forests, and animals that talk. They still imagine the moon as a guardian, the stars as watchers, and the ocean as a place of mystery. Modern books, movies, and bedtime tales continue the tradition, repackaging old myths into new wrappers but carrying the same emotional essence. In a way, the storytellers of the past never left us. Their words are still alive in the stories we tell, the lessons we pass down, and the way we frame nature in our minds. Thunder may be understood as atmospheric electricity now, but a part of us still feels its power. The moon may be a rocky satellite, but it still looks like a companion in the sky. Forests may be ecosystems, but they still feel enchanted when the wind moves through them at dusk. Nature remains a storyteller, and we remain listeners. And so, myths and legends, born from thunder, moonlight, forests, mountains, and waves, continued to shape our dreams. The world itself was the first story, and humans answered with tales that turned everything around them into something meaningful. No matter how far we advance, how much we understand, or how brightly our cities shine, the ancient whispers of nature still drift through our imaginations, inviting us to wonder, to dream, and to remember that everything began with a story for countless generations. Stories lived only in the air. They were spoken, sung, whispered, and carried from memory to memory, like gentle embers passed from one hand to another. But there came a time in human history when people realized that memory alone was fragile, that stories, no matter how beloved, could be lost to forgetfulness, to distance, or simply to the changing of seasons and generations. And so, in a slow, almost magical shift, humans began trying to capture these floating tales in something more lasting. What began as marks in clay, strokes on papyrus, or delicate lines brushed across silk slowly grew into the first written bedtime stories. These were not bedtime stories in the modern sense. No illustrated books, no soft covers, no printed pages, but rather the first attempts to preserve the imagination of a people for those who would come long after. Imagine a world where writing itself was new, where the concept of preserving a story outside the human body was almost miraculous. In ancient Mesopotamia, where the earliest known writing systems emerged, people pressed symbols into wet clay tablets using a sharpened reed. Before that moment, stories had only existed as vibrations in the air. Now, suddenly they could be captured, held, and carried across distances. At first, writing was used for trade, laws, and inventories, but gradually the power of this new tool spread. Scribes began experimenting with recording more than numbers and goods. They started to capture legends, fables, and tales that had floated through their cities for centuries. One of the oldest surviving stories in written form emerged from this region, tales that would later form epics, myths, and moral lessons. Though these texts were not specifically labeled as bedtime stories, they were steeped in themes that had always lived in oral traditions: bravery against the unknown, kindness in a harsh world, loyalty between companions, mysteries of gods and spirits. And as people learned to read, as families gathered around a trained storyteller or a traveling scribe, these clay tablets became the earliest anchors of written storytelling. A parent could retell a tale more faithfully by referencing a written version, ensuring that the details, once fragile and changeable, would remain the same through generations. Then there was Egypt, where the Nile's floodwaters nourished not only crops, but imagination. Here, the creation of papyrus revolutionized the way stories could be preserved. Papyrus, light, flexible, and portable, allowed tales to move far beyond the boundaries of a single village. Egyptian scribes developed a graceful script, and their ink, made from soot and plant gum, left lines that could last for thousands of years. On these papyrus scrolls, ancient Egyptians wrote tales that blended magic and morality, humor and wisdom. Some of their stories were intended for entertainment, others for ritual, others for teaching. But many were gentle narratives told to children in the quiet evenings after the heat of the day had passed. One such tale described the adventures of princes and spirits, animals who spoke wisdom, and gods who intervened in human affairs, not with wrath, but with quiet guidance. These stories were often wrapped in layers of symbolic meaning, but at their heart, they offered comfort. The reassurance that even in a world ruled by unpredictable forces, there was order, purpose, and the possibility of protection. A parent might sit with a child beneath a palm frond shelter, unrolling a piece of papyrus while reciting a story, not because the child could read the symbols, but because hearing the words aloud, knowing they had been preserved for centuries, brought a sense of continuity and belonging. In ancient China, the medium of preservation was different still. There, knowledge and narrative first found a home on oracle bones and bamboo slips. But later, one of the most elegant forms emerged: silk. Thin, smooth, and receptive to ink, silk became a canvas for everything from philosophical teachings to poetry to stories that soothed the mind. The Chinese tradition of storytelling had always been rich, filled with spirits of the mountains, wise animals, legendary emperors, and celestial beings who watched over the world. When these tales began to be recorded on silk, something subtle shifted. Stories became not only voices carried on the wind, but treasures protected by those who valued them. In the soft glow of an oil lamp, a scholar might brush characters onto silk, each stroke deliberate, each character a tiny universe of meaning. The tales preserved in this way often carried themes of harmony, nature, and the delicate balance between the mortal and the divine. These were precisely the kinds of stories that could calm a restless mind, encouraging children to sleep, knowing that the world was watched over by forces both gentle and wise. Silk allowed stories to travel between families, provinces, and dynasties, and as they traveled, they became threads connecting countless generations. Meanwhile, in ancient Greece, storytelling had always flourished through oral performance. Bards and poets recited long epics in marketplaces and gatherings, their voices carrying narratives of heroes, gods, and mythical creatures. But as writing became more widespread, the Greeks too began preserving their stories in written form. They used papyrus like the Egyptians, but also parchment made from softened animal skin that could hold ink with remarkable durability. Greek tales were filled with adventures and emotions, but they also contained lessons about curiosity, courage, humility, and the nature of destiny. While the great epics were not bedtime stories in the strict sense, shorter myths and fables certainly were. Aesop's fables, for instance, with their talking animals and simple morals, became some of the earliest written tales, meant to teach children about human nature through gentler imagery. These stories, copied and recopied by hand, found their way into homes and schools where adults could share them as comforting lessons during quiet evenings. The written word preserved not just the plot of a story, but also its rhythm, the soft cadence of a lion's wisdom, the playful trickery of a clever fox, the steady reassurance that good choices lead to good outcomes. Across all these civilizations, Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, Greece, a common realization emerged. Writing was not merely a tool for recording facts or transactions. It was a vessel for imagination, a way to hold on to the stories that shaped identities, values, and hopes. Parents and elders understood that a written tale had a kind of permanence that memory alone could not guarantee. Even if a storyteller passed on, the story itself could live, continuing to whisper into the dream of children hundreds of years later. The act of writing a story, especially one meant for the young or for moments of rest, carried a certain reverence. It meant the tale was worthy of preservation. It meant the community valued the lessons within it. And so, as more stories were written, they became increasingly intertwined with the daily rhythm of life. A child might fall asleep hearing words that were first shaped centuries earlier by someone from a culture far away, preserved only because an ancient scribe believed the tale deserved to last. These early written stories were not always elaborate. Sometimes they were brief, only a few lines describing a clever animal or a helpful spirit. Sometimes they were long, unfolding across multiple tablets or scrolls, but their purpose remained the same: to make meaning out of the world, to soothe fears, to spark curiosity, and to connect generations. One can imagine a scribe in Mesopotamia pressing symbols into a small tablet late in the evening, the clay cool beneath their fingers. Another in Egypt, carefully rolling a piece of papyrus, satisfied that a tale once vulnerable to forgetting was now safe. A scholar in China dipping a brush into ink, adding the final character to a silk scroll before hanging it to dry. Greek writers shaping letters on parchment, ensuring that the wisdom of a simple fable would not vanish in the tides of time. Each of these people, in their own era and culture, took part in the quiet miracle of preserving imagination. These written tales also allowed stories to blend and travel in ways they never had before. A trader might carry a papyrus scroll across the sea. A diplomat might bring a silk manuscript as a gift. A clay tablet might be copied, translated, or absorbed into a new version. Bit by bit, stories began to cross borders more reliably than they ever had through oral exchange alone. And when stories move, they change. They absorb little pieces of new landscapes, new people, new beliefs. This meant that written bedtime stories were not just preserved, they evolved. They carried traces of every culture they touched, becoming richer, more layered, more resonant. In time, as writing became more accessible and literacy spread, the rituals around bedtime stories deepened. A written tale allowed a parent to read the same words every night, giving a child a sense of stability and familiarity. The written stories became anchors, gentle signals that it was time to rest. Over generations, these stories found new forms: books, manuscripts, illustrated scrolls, bound volumes, but the essence remained. A written bedtime story was a gift of calm, a moment of connection before sleep. Even today, when we read a bedtime story from a book, we are participating in a tradition that stretches back thousands of years to those first written marks in clay, strokes of ink on papyrus, careful brush lines on silk, and letters on parchment. We are holding the echo of ancient scribes who wanted stories to last not just for their own children, for children in distant futures they could never imagine. In every written bedtime tale, there is a quiet history, a lineage of human effort to preserve gentleness in a world that can often be harsh. So when we think of the first written bedtime stories, it is not only about the materials, clay, papyrus, silk, parchment, but about the desire that drove people to use them. It was the desire to protect something fragile yet powerful, the imagination of a culture, the voice of its ancestors, the wisdom meant for its young. Writing gave stories a second life. And because of those early efforts, the tales that once flickered like sparks in the night air now glow steadily, illuminating the dreams of children and adults across countless generations. For all the changes that have unfolded across human history, for all the technology, the glowing screens, the fast communication, the endless streams of information, something ancient still lingers in our evenings. Something remarkably simple. Something that belongs to a world much older than electricity, older than books, older even than writing itself. It is the quiet ritual of telling a story before sleep, war sleep, a tradition that has survived every shift in culture, every invention, every revolution. A ritual that continues not because we lack alternatives, but because humans across every age and every landscape still find comfort in the familiar rhythm of a gentle narrative carrying them into the night. When we look back, bedtime stories began as pure necessity. Humans needed comfort when darkness fell. They needed something to soften the edges of fear, to explain the unknown, to make sense of their place in the world. And as centuries passed, the reasons for telling these stories changed and evolved, yet the instinct behind them remained the same. The desire to settle the heart and quiet the mind before rest. Today, even in a world overflowing with entertainment, knowledge, and noise, bedtime stories endure not out of tradition alone, but because they serve a deeply human function that nothing else has ever fully replaced. Think about a typical modern night. Phones buzz, screens glow, and the world seems unwilling to quiet down, even after sunset. Yet there comes a moment, often subtle and small, when a parent puts their device aside, or a reader closes their laptop, or someone turns off the television and reaches instead for a book, or simply begins to speak softly into the darkness. This shift isn't accidental. It's instinctive. It comes from the recognition that technology can stimulate, but stories soothe, and soothing is what the night demands. Even children, surrounded by digital worlds and animated characters, respond with a unique kind of calm when a real human voice tells them a story. The cadence of speech, the pauses, the small fluctuations in tone, these are things no screen can imitate with the same emotional effect. A bedtime story is never just information. It is presence. It is connection. It is a signal to the brain and the body that the day is ending, that it is safe to let go, that the world will wait until morning. Part of why bedtime stories still matter today is that they create a shared space between people, between parent and child, between partners, between friends, even between a reader and their own younger self. In that shared space, time seems to slow down. The noise of the day becomes distant. All that remains is the gentle flow of narrative, the quiet invitation to imagine. This shared space is not an accident. It is something humans have always sought. Throughout history, storytelling has been one of the most reliable ways to build bonds. It reassures us that we are not alone, that our experiences intertwine, that we are connected by more than just routine. Bedtime stories also survive because they protect something fragile but vital: imagination. In the rush of modern life, imagination is often overshadowed by productivity, deadlines, and efficiency. Stories, told softly at night, restore it. They take us somewhere else, somewhere unhurried and full of possibility. The stories children hear at bedtime help shape the landscapes of their dreams, their creativity, and their sense of wonder. And for adults, bedtime stories, whether read, whispered, or listened to, create a bridge back to a time when imagination was easy, unburdened, and limitless. There is also something deeply comforting in the structure of a bedtime story. Stories follow patterns. They have beginnings, middles, and endings. They promise resolution. In a world full of uncertainty, that promise of resolution carries enormous emotional weight. It gives the listener a sense that even if the real world is chaotic, the world inside a story is manageable, understandable, and safe. It tells us that challenges lead somewhere, that mysteries have answers, that journeys conclude. These are the kinds of reassurances that the mind craves before drifting into sleep. They help settle the internal chaos that so many people carry through their days. Modern bedtime stories are also a way to preserve culture, values, and identity. Parents tell the stories they grew up hearing. Grandparents pass along tales from their childhood. Families preserve old folk tales, old jokes, old characters. Not because they need to, but because it feels natural. These stories become threads woven through generations. They teach children where they come from, what their ancestors found meaningful, what their culture cherishes. And even when the stories are new, made up on the spot, they still carry the tone and warmth of the storyteller's own history. Technology, ironically, has made bedtime storytelling more accessible rather than replacing it. Audiobooks, sleep podcasts, narrated tales, and whispered stories have become tools that replicate the soothing effect once provided only by a nearby voice. People who live alone may fall asleep listening to gentle narration. Travelers may play calming stories to feel less isolated in unfamiliar places. Couples may turn on soft storytelling to share a relaxing moment together. The presence of a story, whether told by a loved one or by a voice in a speaker, fills the room with something human and reassuring. Even meditation apps and sleep aid tools frequently rely on narrative. They might call it a sleep story, a dream journey, or an audio adventure, but the format remains essentially the same as the timeless bedtime story. A slow-moving narrative, low stakes, gentle imagery, predictable pacing, all designed to lull the mind toward rest. And people respond to these because the brain is wired for story. Long before we learned logic or science, we learned through narrative. our minds drift toward stories naturally. They occupy the imagination in a way that quiets anxiety, reduces stress, and creates a sense of emotional safety. Another reason bedtime stories persist today is that the act of storytelling itself is therapeutic. For the person telling the story, it encourages patience, mindfulness, and presence. For the person listening, it fosters trust, relaxation, and emotional regulation. Children especially benefit from the predictability of a nightly story. It becomes a ritual, a signal that the day is complete, that comfort is near, and that sleep is welcome. Rituals matter. They anchor us. They give shape to our days, meaning to our routines. And bedtime stories, more than most rituals, carry emotional weight that leaves a lasting imprint. There is also a simple but profound truth. Humans crave softness. Not weakness or fragility, but gentleness, a quiet place to lay their thoughts before sleep. They bring light to the darkness without overwhelming the senses. They create small worlds where fears can be faced indirectly through characters, where lessons can be learned gently, where tension can exist without danger. Children process their emotions through stories, but adults do too. The stories we hear at night help our minds organize the day's experiences, put worries into perspective, and transition into dreams that restore us. The physicality of bedtime stories also matter. The turning of pages, the softness of a blanket, the dimness of a bedside lamp, all of these sensory details become part of the ritual. They create an environment associated with safety and comfort. Even in households where physical books are rare, the sound of a voice telling a story creates a similar effect. It is the sound of someone choosing to spend unhurried time with you, choosing to guide you gently towards sleep. In a world full of distractions, that attention carries tremendous emotional power. Bedtime stories persist because they are one of the few cultural practices that ask nothing of us except presence. There is no performance, no deadline, no expectation of productivity. The story does not need to be perfect. It does not need to be long. It does not need to be profound. What matters is the sharing of it. The act of storytelling creates an intimate moment where two minds meet in a world of imagination. That closeness can strengthen relationships in ways that daylight hours often cannot. There is also something universal about the themes that bedtime stories explore. They often revolve around kindness, bravery, curiosity, discovery, friendship, and transformation. These are themes that resonate across cultures and languages. They remind us that we share common hopes and fears, that human experience has been shaped by the same emotional currents for thousands of years. Bedtime stories are one of the few spaces where the wisdom of the past meets the present in a way that feels natural and reassuring. Even adults who read bedtime stories to themselves, whether through books or audio, often describe a similar feeling, a return to innocence. A feeling of being held by the narrative, a sense that their minds can rest, even if only for a few minutes. Bedtime stories offer a temporary escape from the pressures of adult life, allowing the listener to drift into a state of softness and simplicity. This emotional shift is essential for sleep, and storytelling remains one of the most effective ways to achieve it. The reason this ritual endures is not complicated. Humans are storytelling creatures. We always have been. We pass down lessons through narrative, we connect through narrative, and when the lights dim and the world quiets, our oldest instinct returns, the instinct to gather close, to listen, to be comforted by a voice gently guiding us into dreams. And so we still tell bedtime stories today, not because we need them in a practical sense, but because they speak to something ancient within us. They remind us that despite all the changes in the world, we remain the same in our longing for comfort, connection, and calm at the end of the day. They remind us that humans have always fallen asleep to the rhythm of a story, and likely always will. And in that soft continuity, across generations, across cultures, across continents, there is a profound beauty. A reminder that even as centuries pass, the human heart still finds rest in the same simple ritual, a gentle voice, a quiet tale, and the slow fading of the waking world into dreams.